You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The world's biggest emerging economies have their plates full with challenges to free trade and the specter of sluggish growth. Ahead of the Leaders' Summit, BRICS foreign ministers gathered in Pretoria to discuss how their countries could work together, if possible, to create a stable environment for more balanced and inclusive growth, not just for these countries, but also for the rest of the world.
BRICS is the acronym for an association of 5 major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Foreign ministers from BRICS members have spent the day in Pretoria discussing governance, multilateralism, and trade. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says BRICS nations share international obligations in safeguarding global stability and advancing common development.
We need to deepen the cooperation, dig into new driver forces of full growth, and focus on innovation. We need to stick to dialogue and consultation, deepen mutual trust, and set an example into state relations. Be open and inclusive.
BRICS countries do face problems of their own, no longer enjoying the growth momentum that started a decade ago. There are other challenges, such as Western sanctions on Russia and political turmoil in Brazil. Meanwhile, the world is witnessing unprecedented changes and challenges: rising unilateralism and protectionism, a re-emerging Cold War mentality, income inequality, and social instability. Better cooperation among BRICS members has become more important.
The evolving world in which we live requires us to keep track with multifaceted and dynamic changes that are occurring. We're also beholden to our resolutions and ensuring that we realize them in this changing world.
The meeting is expected to lay the foundation for the annual summit of the grouping in Johannesburg next month, which will be an important milestone for BRICS cooperation, as it represents a decade of BRICS ties at the highest diplomatic level.
For more talks about the BRICS meeting, let's ask our panelists. They are coming from 4 of the 5 BRICS countries. With us in our Beijing studio, Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies with Renmin University. Professor Wang just came back from South Africa. Good to see you, sir, here. Here in Beijing, we want to welcome Mr. Madhav Nalapat, the UNESCO Peace Chair and Director of the Geopolitics and International Relations Department at Manipal University, coming from India. Good to see you, Professor, here in Beijing.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And also, we have in Moscow another guest joining us who's going to talk to us later in the program. And now, in Johannesburg, South Africa, we have Luanda Mupanose, who is a researcher under the Governance and the Foreign Policy Program with South African Institute of International Affairs. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Ms. Mupanose, of course, South Africa, this time rotating presidency of the BRICS countries, hosting also the foreign ministers of the BRICS nations. What do you think of the agenda they have on hand, which is try to safeguard the rule of trade worldwide, particularly for the interests of the emerging economies?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question more clearly. Can you
the question is, how do you think the BRICS countries are going to serve to guard the rules of global trade?
If I'm understanding, the question is about global trade and about
yes,
the
indeed. Go ahead.
Forum that they've just had in Johannesburg. Oh, okay. I just want to maybe make a comment about the fact that, you know, there's been so much energy and invigoration leading up to the BRICS summit, where South Africa has been visible and the foreign ministers of all the BRICS countries have been visible, and there have been reassuring leading up to the BRICS summit of the cooperation that has been enhanced between the BRICS countries. And in terms of trade, nothing yet has been said that is comprehensive, but, you know, there have been more discussions about the themes, things like gender and the Women's Forum, things like the 4th Industrial Revolution, health and vaccination, and the themes for the upcoming BRICS summit. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of the Gender and Women's Forum, it's the first of its kind. It's the first time it has been discussed as a theme. And we do look forward to hearing more about that when the heads of states meet in July.
Okay, well, we want to hear more about gender, but one of the things more important is also at the same time about global trade. Professor Nalapat, I want to invite you here. When you see the G7 finance minister, their meeting almost becomes so-called the G6+1. So people wonder about what about the trade agenda for the BRICS countries? How are these biggest emerging economies are going to come together? Do they have, Professor Nalapat, the capability of safeguarding the global trade rules?
Well, I'd like to say that China has been a very strong supporter of a system of trade which is open, and where countries basically welcome trade with each other and they don't impose protectionist measures. In that, it is now quite a contrast from the United States, which is now imposing protectionist measures. For example, if you were to take the United States trade office seriously, Canada, France, the UK, the EU are actually major security threats for the United States. Japan is a security threat for the United States,
yes,
which frankly is quite absurd. So I think India as well believes in open trade. Our Prime Minister has said that several times, as has the President of China. So I think so far these two economies are concerned, they're on the same page.
Right. Let's also have Professor Wang here with us in Beijing. I mean, you've been working on the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, for quite some time. Free trade is extremely important. That is the fundamental that BRI is going to rely on in a way. So, Professor Wang, the question, though, is will emerging economies together be able to be strong enough to safeguard the rules of the global trade? Emerging economies all want global trade.
Definitely. The BRICS, even this concept produced by the West, it's a more Goldman Sachs for investment diversity, but a more political, strategical cooperation, people-to-people connections, which more represents a new type of international relations. Our BRICS members is not like the US-led or European-led some multilateral core and the periphery systems. We are very equal. There's no one that dominates BRICS.
Right. But the question whether you have the capability of safeguarding global trade rules, that's my question. It's a very important question.
I come
it
back
also
and
shows
to
the
system.
relevancy of this forum, whether it is relevant or not.
Of course, BRICS now is safeguarding the multilateralism, and trade is definitely global even. And emerging countries that even the volumes may be less than the West, but very dynamic. So the trade volume more increased from China, from other emerging countries. So I think now is the test whether the emerging countries can really play a role, not just to make the voice be heard, but also reform the political international system to keep the multilateral system moving on, but reform to be more opening, inclusiveness and sustainable.
That's interesting. You talk about reform. Yes, indeed, Professor Wang, that has been the topic for quite some years. Even though we see some reform, the pace is relatively slow. Having said that, though, we also joined in Russia by Mark Sleboda, who is an international relations security analyst over there. Mr. Sleboda, though, this is not a new topic, the reform of the international system. But now it's not just about the reform of the international system. The bottom line has already become much lower, which is whether this international system still works and whether there is going to be enough safeguard for the current international system. It seems that people have long forgotten there has to be a lot of work needed for the reform, because now it's really the existence of the international system or not, Mr. Sleboda.
Yeah, there's a problem when we're talking about the term international system, because often countries such as Russia, China, India, and the West, when they speak of the international system, are speaking of two entirely different systems. Russia and China speak of the international system created in the post-World War II era with the created of the UN Security Council, and the UN Charter's founding bedrock principles of non-interference in domestic affairs and sovereignty and respect for other states' sovereignty. While the West speaks of the liberal international order, the post-92 era, it began perhaps during Bretton Woods, but especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the U.S. came to be a veritable hegemon, a unipolar era. And that is the control of the heights of global finance and trade, as well as militarily, that they are trying to still enforce around the world, kind of a fight back against the emergence of a multipolar world.
Going into history for a long time, but my question really to you, Mr. Sloboda, the question is the core question. That is the international system that we're talking about, particularly international trade system, can be guarded well by the emerging economies coming together, such as in the platform of the BRICS country? We don't want to go that far back into the history.
Yeah, no, I don't think they have yet shown the strength of purpose. They haven't shown the strength of unity required to act together against the unipolar system. I think the BRICS has basically hit kind of a frozen period. It's paused with the seizure of power in Brazil by a right-wing leader in what amounts to a legislative coup. India moving closer in relations to the United States, flirting with them militarily, with the Quad, in what they now term the Indo-Pacific.
Okay.
And even in South Africa, there have been critiques of South African president, the new South African president, Ramaphosa, is flirting with the West and moving away from BRICS. So BRICS certainly isn't that forum, and if BRICS isn't that forum for emerging powers, you know, to exert their influence, then there isn't any hope for it at the current time.
What about those questions raised by Mr. Sloboda, Professor Nalaphat from India? Are the internal political situations within some of the BRIC countries and the different stages of spurring up their economy once again? We know some economies are slow, some are much better, but will those differences be able to prevent these BRICS countries, emerging economies, come together and guard the most important thing, which is the international trade rules?
Well, I'd like to say that our Russian friend has pointed to some political trends. But may I point out that because of social media and because of the higher conscientization of the people, it is much more difficult now to continue to impose policies where the people at large are shortchanged. And a lot of the policies that the Bretton Woods system introduced are policies which basically benefited a few people and a few countries. Now, when an effort is made to go beyond those policies, those few people and those few countries naturally are resisting that. But I'm not as pessimistic as he is. Take, for example, India. Recently, we opened, along with our Iranian friends, the Chabahar port. And India and Iran have excellent relations. India and Russia have been having good relations for the last 70 years. I mean, recently Prime Minister Modi and President Putin met at Sochi. Now, at the same time, India and the United States have very close relations, and these are getting closer. So I think the West will have to be more pragmatic, but I agree with him that it will become more pragmatic only when leaders in the rest of the world stand up for their interests and tell them, look, you can't have a system which works for you and not for everybody.
So whose interest first? Or will it become a question of whose rule is it? I think that is a big question in our world today. Professor Wang, Professor Nalaphat would like to say India's multilateral approach on different platforms with different powers of the world. And what about China?
China is the same, I think. We have the SCO summit is being held in Qingdao.
Shanghai Cooperation Organization, just for those who do not know all of these abbreviations.
Also, I think BRICS is also a contribute to the G20. If BRICS fail, G20 will fail. And then it's terrible for the world. So BRICS should work together, but it's not work alone. We should work together with European Union, with all other stakeholders. So-called the BRICS Plus, I think this initiative, China last summit, I think very popular now in the BRICS member states.
BRICS Plus, meaning BRICS with other emerging and also developing economies around the world.
So BRICS is a hope. of the new international relations, and maybe cannot safeguard the openness or the inclusiveness by themselves. But if we work together to point to that directions and work together with other stakeholders, I think it's
Professor
possible.
Wang, you do see the different BRICS countries, particularly China, Russia, and India, whose economy seems to be on the upswing, even though Russia's slow as a result of sanctions, but still picking up right now. They are trying to create their own reaching out ways to the rest of the world. And they try to create their own logic of international relations. So how will all these complicated logics of all these interesting countries within BRICS be able to work together, not against each other? I think that is the thing we're talking about here. All the webs that they have created individually, how will they come together rather than separate them? Professor
So
Wang,
that we said it's
it's
a new
giving me a big
organization,
smile.
new
I guess
type.
in Johannesburg you talk about this, right?
I can just come back from Johannesburg. There's the BRICS Academic Forum,
Yes.
which also mentioned many things about that. That this is a new baby, how to create a story that we are actually born for kind of the mission, even separated by different continents.
Okay.
But actually we are the same identity. So this is, of course, long way to go.
Professor Nalapa, you have some views about that?
Well, I'd like to say that, frankly, my problem with BRICS, it's not been ambitious enough. Now, it should aim, for example, at much easier
Our
visa
Indian friend
access.
is always ambitious, right?
Well, not enough in the case of India also. Now, for example, visas. We need to ensure that visas are more common. We need to ensure, for example, that each other's currency. Why can't we trade more in each other's currencies? Now, there are so many
You mean
ways.
currency swap? Is that what you're saying?
Precisely.
Common currency.
Precisely. So my point is, we need to go, frankly, beyond some self-imposed boundaries, and we need now to take some bigger leaps.
Okay, let's see if the leaders of the BRIC countries are going to hear our voices. Let's also go to Ms. Mumboze in South Africa. Can you hear me
Yes.
clearly this time?
I can hear you better.
What
yeah.
about that? I mean, these countries all have their own little universe they have created beautifully. But how will these webs be able to wave together to make sure these countries working together and it's going to be 5 together, bigger than 5?
I think I'd like to just start by saying that some of the nuances of the BRICS is that the BRICS is only like 10 years old, firstly. It's they're like the new kids in the block. And for people that are a grouping that is like 10 years old, they've been able to accomplish quite significantly. And, you know, they don't seek to compete with the international order as it is, but they seek to complement it as representatives of the developing South. That's their mandate. I mean, these are countries that are sovereign, that have their own national interests, and that's what they're pursuing. They don't seek to misrepresent themselves by saying that they're doing something else. However, they want to take the developing South with it. If you look at the BRICS currently and its outreach in Africa leading up to the summit, you'll notice that some of the invitees as part of like the BRICS Plus outreach is that there are key African countries, current and incoming chairpersons of like some key regional communities. There's like the regional economic communities of the developing South and the Secretary General of the United Nations. So you kind of have to see how they try to rope in the discussions and not just talk
Right.
about the BRICS in a vacuum, but also seek to also advance like the interest of the developing South. So in my vantage point, I do want to look at what actually the BRICS outcomes will be for Africa and how Africa can actually also synergize with the BRICS to get some developments.
Yes.
Our colleague earlier mentioned that Cyril Ramaphosa is moving away from the BRICS and leaning west, and I would sort of discourage that thinking of the one or the other. South Africa is open for business, as it has said, and it actually seeks to advance its interest, whether it be in the West or in the BRICS, but the BRICS relies an important partner to South Africa.
See, all the BRICS countries have, and their representatives have very strong minds here to speak out for their own countries and certainly for the common good of the BRICS. Before we go, one final question. If every one of you give one sentence, that will be fine. I know you're great speakers, but one sentence if you can. Will BRICS, this mechanism, still remain competitive if you see all the things going on? SCO, the G7, you also see the different kinds of summit, even including Trump and Kim in a few days. All of these things going on around us, world is changing fast. Will BRICS remain relevant? That is the ultimate question. What about your thought? Let's go to South Africa. One sentence if you can. What does it take?
I think if I can give you just 2 words,
Yes.
Or rather forwards. The BRICS remains important in terms of like the global rules and agenda setting. They have a seat at the table in terms of those two things.
All right, Professor Nalapat.
Well, I'd like to say that I do believe geopolitical winds are changing, and that's part of the reason why the Trump administration is no longer taking an Atlanticist view, but an Indo-Pacific view. So the winds of change are coming, and they're inevitable.
Mr. Sloboda from Russia.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is really needed that is lacking is geopolitical alignment. The BRICS nations are always very sure to devour bloc development. But the world is becoming increasingly polarized, and the BRICS aren't aligning, and if they can't do that, then they can't cooperate effectively together.
One sentence if you can, Professor Wang. That's a test.
BRICS is not just BRICS. It's intercontinental cooperation. BRICS, like the bicycle, it should keep a balance by moving on. I think they still have hope.
5 wheels. Bicycle, that's interesting. But I'm going to keep that analogy in mind and see how BRICS are moving forward. Wang Yiwei, Madhav Nalapat, Mark Sloboda, and Luanda Mupoze, coming from China, India, Russia, and also South Africa of the BRICS countries. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it.